Michael, we're back. It's been a couple weeks since we've done a podcast.
Absolutely. We had some time off, but it was productive time off, Travis.
I think so.
You were presenting at a conference. I took some students to some Olympic weightlifting meets. So
that's right.
We had
a good time. So the special treat today is Michael's going to teach me about an article that I don't even know the name of the article.
Nope, we tried to do this completely blind, so we'll see how this works out. But today, I decided to pick one that's interesting because it springboards a little bit off of some conversations Travis and I have been having in weeks prior to this about visualization and how much that can work if you believe in it, and also if you can do it in different ways, like visualizing from your eyes as opposed to from a third person.
Third person, right.
Yeah, and Kernodle actually was telling me about some EMG studies to back that sort of thing up. So I
this is Dr. Mike Kernodle, who teaches in our physical education program.
Oh, yes, of course. Right, and so that got me thinking about other things where you can influence your athletes without them realizing you're influencing it. But, of course, that brings up questions about whether or not you really should, because that might violate the trust you have between you and your athletes, right?
So you're purposely deceiving them, essentially,
right? So today's topic is the placebo effect in sports performance.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
So
sounds great.
Yeah, so I've got a 2009 review article here from Sports Medicine by Christopher J. Beattie and Abigail Fode, perhaps, I think, from Canterbury, UK. So we're going to run through a few of them. What we see is that classically, though, the placebo effect has been studied in pharmacological aspects.
Right, it's easy to do there. Do you have a fake drug and a real drug?
Oh, right? Yeah, much easier. But actually teasing out performance improvements is a little bit more difficult because it seems like it's going to be a multifaceted issue as we go through these things. So we'll start out and say that there was one study done back in 1972, the first one where it looked at placebo effect in exercise performance. And that one used 15 weightlifters. Ariel and Seville were the ones to perform this. The weightlifters were pretty experienced.
Are these weightlifters like the actual sport of weightlifting, or are they just...
Not capital W weightlifting. Okay. No, it's the more like powerlifting, let's say, and how they had them test.
Resistance training technique.
Yeah. Sure. At least recreationally trained, but it seemed a little bit more, 5 times a week for at least 2 years.
Okay.
And they tested them on bench press, seated overhead press, squat, and let's see here. And just a standing overhead press, excuse me, yeah.
I was rooting for calf raise.
Oh, no, not this time, although maybe it would work, because what we found was that, so they did a counterbalance study, or excuse me, not counterbalance, but where they had them serve as their own controls for the first 4 weeks and then do the testing and training and see if they made improvements. So they had that baseline improvement level. And then they told the athletes that they were going to give them 10 milligrams a day of steroid.
Okay.
And what they found after that second 4 weeks is that they had significant increases in everything but the seated press. But a little bit under 10% bench press, 9.6, overhead press, 8.5, squat 13.8% in just that 4 weeks of training while they thought that they were on.
Right.
So that, of course, says that if you make people think that they're on something, then they seem to perform a little bit better. So they got to believe it, and that's one thing we want to keep in mind as we go forward.
Right.
Now, jump ahead to the year 2000 is the next time that we actually started to look at this sort of thing. And this time we were trying to figure out, if they believe it, it seems like we know that they're going to improve.
Okay.
What if they stop believing?
Okay.
So this one...
Someone's going to crash the party here at
some point.
Right,
yeah. So let's bring them back down to earth and see if all those gains they made go away.
Okay.
And what we used here with Magnaris in 2000 was 11 national level powerlifters that had to do this. They were also told they were given a fast-acting steroid, and then after a week they saw increases close to, not quite as high as the first one, about 3 to 5% for most of these gains.
In 2 weeks, though?
In 1 week after treatment.
So, ridiculous.
And national level powerlifters, so I mean that's like dozens of pounds, if not hundreds. Yeah, no, probably not hundreds unless we're talking about the squat, perhaps. But still, we're getting pretty close there to some pretty impressive gains.
Right.
Now then, after that, though, the week after, they told 6 of the subjects that, no, we were just joking. It was a placebo.
That's awesome.
But then they let the other ones still think they were on it. Yep, and it totally reversed it. So the people who were then, the ruse is up, they went back to baseline. In fact, they went and dropped a little bit below, in some cases for the deadlift, negative 0.4% of a loss there.
Okay.
So, and then the subjects still on, maintained their improvements, about 3 and then 4%. 4.4 is the highest it went up. But those that continue to think that they were on the steroid continue to improve and maintain those strength proofs, but The other group
That's pretty awesome.
went right off
This
it.
is the George Costanza. It's not a lie.
If you believe it.
Right?
Exactly so. So there might be something here for our athletes, of trying to take advantage of the placebo effect to get more out of their training, or at least maybe manage fatigue in a different way because, if our student athletes, they don't always have time for sleeping or always eating enough.
Right,
they're on a
right.
bus or on a plane or in
Right.
class or
Sure.
at practice. So
Yeah.
it really cuts down the hours to do. So maybe there's a way you could work this to be able to
Right.
take advantage of these things on and off the field, like in the weight room.
So for these two studies, the first ones you told me, it was all basically about a fake steroid they were
Yes.
using. So are the rest of them like that too, or are there different sorts of interventions?
So, of course, the best way to test this would be to give somebody
An
a real
actual-
steroid,
right, sure, right.
and then also another group saying you're giving them a fake
Okay,
one.
so
and
a
then,
true placebo kind of effect.
and that actually brings up some recommendations from other studies as they tried to get into this. Now, there's some cycling studies done with caffeine and things like that, but what they ended up figuring out, there's something called a Latin square that we should probably be doing for this, where we have a treatment, so giving steroid and telling people you're giving them
Right,
one,
right.
giving a placebo and telling them you're giving them placebo, and then flip the other two, where
I
you
see.
tell them you're giving them
I
something,
gotcha.
but giving them placebo,
What
tell
do
them
they call it?
placebo.
Did you say Aladdin's
Latin.
Oh, Latin square.
Yeah, Latin.
I was picturing
square.
Robin Williams' character.
Oh,
in
in
a genie
Aladdin.
bottle. Yeah, no, okay.
Coming out
Latin
some-
square. Okay.
Yep, Latin square. So you kind of cover all your bases that way,
Okay.
but some IRBs may not be too readily approving of giving
Right.
college students or any athletes in general some sort of steroids.
right,
So
right.
presumably there's issues with that. But as we go forward, we start to see things like that being approved for, I guess, not quite as illegal substances
Okay.
like caffeine.
But caffeine, right. You can
so
do that, right.
We're going to start to see that. So elite cyclists here were given by, and this is by the author Beatty in 2006 and 7, were told they would either be given 0 milligrams, 4.5, or 9 milligrams per kilo of their body weight
Sure.
dose of caffeine. However, they're all placebos.
Okay.
So what they found for these guys was that when they were told they were on placebo, produced 1.4% less power. And when they were on one of them, 1.3% more. So
Okay.
placebo effect's real, apparently. You
Yeah,
can
I
just tell
guess.
somebody and they know that they're going
Right.
to have this impact. It's just word around is
Right,
that.
right.
So that's actually something they took it further with another study, was they actually gave them literature and said that, okay, here's how great caffeine is for cyclists.
Okay.
So you want to be taking this. You want to
Right.
be taking these specific
Right,
numbers of
right,
caffeine.
right.
Basically everything to reinforce the methodology they had
Right,
in their
right.
study. So, 4.5 is good, but 9, that's going to be a little bit better.
Sure.
Definitely better than 0 for sure, right? And of course, they improved commensurately
I
with
gotcha,
that,
I
where
gotcha.
the more he gave them, the more improvement they had. So,
Interesting.
yeah, pretty interesting stuff right there. So, going into the belief a little bit more, we had McClung and Collins in 2007 report on track athletes, 12 men, 4 women.
The best athletes.
The best athletes, of course, definitely most functional athletes, I think, that there are, although some might disagree with that, I suppose. Maybe it all depends on your definition of functionality.
Right.
So they were given an inert substance and told it was an active drug.
Okay.
And this was in one of those Latin square designs, so they were informed that they were getting a
Right,
drug and
right.
actually received it, but it was inert in this case, and
Right.
then all of those other ones
Sure.
there from on down. So what they ended up finding out here was that the most important factor in this is their belief on whether or not they were told they were actually getting the drug for
Okay.
important performance. So, and the main effect they saw was on RPE, because the drug they were told was going to decrease fatigue, increase their resistance to that,
Right.
and improve their performance because of it. So they felt accordingly
Right, okay, yeah,
that they
right.
would. So, but in the groups that didn't receive that or were told that they didn't receive it,
Right.
they didn't see that kind
Okay,
of significant
sure, sure.
interaction there. So it seems like it really is whether or not you believe that you're taking it. So it's your perception that
Right.
really matters
Right,
here.
right.
And a lot of it seems like it can be influenced based on your either preconceived notions or what's been told to you right beforehand.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's where I think it gets into something that our trainers and coaches could use but have to be careful with, because it does involve deception with your athletes.
It can, for certain, I think. Yeah.
But it might be an interesting way to, I guess, if somebody does have a problem with substance abuse or abusing steroids, then
Right.
you might be able to wean them off them in there if you are the one, I guess, supplying them or
Right.
you have an inkling there.
Right.
But it's not always going to be some kind of AAS. Sometimes they're non-pharmacological
Right.
effects that we can find.
Yeah, I
So
mean, when we do something like in class, when we talk about ergogenic aids, most people think about some kind of supplement or drug that you're using, but in reality, an ergogenic aid is just any type of thing that you do that improves performance, and that could include warm-up or it includes hypnosis or mental imagery. All sorts of things like that can be included in that ergogenic aid kind of category. And I'm curious to know, like, what kind of research would be out there in regards to a specific type of a warm-up that might be more effective than another kind of a warm-up. And it'd be difficult to do a control study that has a placebo effect, because how do you... It's one thing to give somebody a drug that they think is a real drug, and you can fake that pretty easily, but it's hard to fake a warm-up.
Exactly.
You either know you're doing something or you're not
or
doing
you're
something.
You're just hanging around, And I think one way they might go about that is just different types of warm-ups. I know we've messed around before with this
the vibration
platform,
plates,
and having people warm up on there as opposed to more traditional stretching or light activity.
But you think about, like, a lot of research studies that we do, the warm-up procedure is generally 5 minutes on a bike, because you're trying to standardize it, because if you do a dynamic warm-up that might include some kind of light plyometric sort of activity or light jogging or whatever, everyone's going to respond differently to that sort of a thing.
Especially depending on how far you go along in that and their training status, you might end up damaging the muscle fiber. I mean, you can't have people doing a lot of jumping around if they're about to do some drop jumps. Or
that whole fatigue fitness paradigm where it's like, when you increase fitness, you're also inducing fatigue, and you can have fatigue that essentially masks whatever fitness level you have, right?
Exactly, and so you can take your warm-ups way too far. So you see that also because there's a lot of different ways to warm up that we see people doing. Either just picking the activity they're going to do and warm up into that motion, or just more of a generalized warm up or a more dynamic, so you're getting a lot of those
Sure, and I think in the last, say, 15 years, you're seeing a lot less reliance on static stretching as part of warm-up. But I remember when I was a kid growing up in the 80s and even in the early 90s, like, we included a lot of static stretching as part of the warm-up, but you really don't see that much at all anymore. You see mostly dynamic kinds of movements, because it just appears that the research indicates that you're seeing a decrease in acute strength and power output after a static stretching protocol. And so in a lot of cases, the only people you see doing a lot of static stretching as part of their warm-up are people that they just can't physically get into that range of motion they need to for their activity, like a gymnast or a wrestler, or maybe a person that's doing some kind of heavy load squats that they have trouble with those deep kind of positions. But they still kind of contend that ideally you want to have a dynamic range of motion, because that's what those sports and games require, not a static level of flexibility.
And not just that, I think that transfers over into everyday life and the quality of life. You're going to be a lot better off in trying to keep yourself from slipping on ice or falling over if you do have that quickness or that ability to move in more than just sagittal plane all the time.
It's the analogy behind the lions on the Serengeti plain. It's like you don't see them stretch out before they go chase down an animal. It's like they just go, right? They don't warm up at all, period, but they certainly don't stretch out before they do things.
Right, yeah.
But on the other side of the coin, like my dog, every time he gets up from a nap, first thing he does is stretch out, before he starts to do anything. So
so there might be something in that initial, whether it's, I don't know, maybe breaking myosin heads off of actin or whatever. I've heard varying theories.
But it's still, in the context of this discussion about placebo effect and things, it's harder to measure, I think, those sorts of activities as opposed to a drug or a medication or something like that. It's a little bit easier to maybe determine the effect of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think to your point about you need to believe that it's accurate. It's like if you're a coach that firmly believes that one form of warm-up is superior to another, if the athletes you're working with believe that coach, then they're going to find that warm-up, I'd like to see, for example, if a coach believes a certain kind of warm-up will reduce the incidences of hamstring strains, for example, would you actually see a reduction in hamstring strains versus a coach that maybe has a warm-up protocol that doesn't convey that belief in that this warm-up is designed to do this specific thing?
And that's why we do these PNF stretches for your hamstrings with a partner that you all are laughing at, but I'm telling you it's going to save your life someday.
So, exactly.
Yeah. That would be very interesting. I'm not sure if there is any literature
I don't know.
on that.
I remember at the end, when I was strength coaching back in Wisconsin, we got to the end of the football season, and the athletic trainers were kind of doing a debrief at the end of the year and looking at what injuries occurred and things. And the athletic trainers were reporting upon ACL injuries and kind of looking at, what things can be changed in the program next year, both from the athletic training perspective, but also from the strength training perspective, that we can help reduce maybe injury rates. And one of the things that they reflected on, I remember very clearly, was they said, we didn't have anyone that had any kind of neck strains this year. And said, what are you doing what are you doing in the weight room to try to address that? I mean, how did this come about? And I said, we didn't do anything. We didn't do anything. We didn't do any neck lateral strength or anything. We didn't include any of those kinds of activities. And I think it was the look on the athletic trainer's face was just a look of almost like shock. It's just like, well, there weren't any injuries. You must have done something. It's like, we didn't do anything in this case. And and we talk about the ACL tears, like a lot of them are non-contact. And it's, well, there's not much I can do about that in a weight training. It's
right, yeah,
and to some degree you can look at
strengthen support structures and all
right,
that. But maybe, after a while, then you plant twist with enough force, and it's no matter who you are,
exactly.
You see,
right. But I mean, I think it's interesting this whole discussion because it's in our disciplines where we're kind of looking at really physical kinds of interventions, essentially, as opposed to. And obviously, we have nutritional interventions, that kind of thing, but the physical interventions, it's harder to study that, I think, because people respond very, very differently to that.
Yeah, because, even in nutrition, now you're seeing more and more frequently us reporting on responders and non-responders and trying to figure out what's going on.
What's going on.
Yeah, we've got the molecular tools to do a lot of that stuff. Now, it's a little bit easier with nutrition because you can usually figure out how it's supposed to interact and then what doesn't happen or what else is happening if you've got your hands on some metabolomics or proteomics equipment. But we don't have those kind of supercomputers in our offices, I know. But you're going to get a little bit better understanding of it than with something so, I guess, more general than just giving you however much vitamin C it is, things like that.
But along those lines of believing things and not believing things, when I was in college, when I was running track, Dr. Jack Curtis was one of the he's a health educator there and physical education and that sort of thing, and he was a big believer in mental imagery. In fact, he published a couple books on it, and then he went on to work with the Brewers Farm Organization on getting them proper mental imagery to help for their sports and things, and so. We actually use his program as part of our training for track and field. And so obviously it was not a physical form of training. It was all mental imagery. And so it essentially revolved around a couple kind of key concepts. Like first you have to have a relaxation because when you're relaxed and your mind is in a relaxed state, you're more susceptible to any kind of suggestions you're going to give. And so the mental imagery program that we use, it wasn't a coach that would hypnotize us. Essentially you were, in a way, kind of do like a self-hypnosis. You'd first get yourself in a relaxed state.
I see.
Then you'd have positive affirmations, things like, I'm powerful, I'm fast. Those kind of, and so each person was encouraged to kind of pick their own personal positive affirmation that was a relatively short statement.
Kind of like a mantra almost.
Yeah, like a mantra, exactly. And so you would inject that into your subconscious brain when you're in that relaxed state. And then on top of that, you would build mental rehearsal where you would try to mental recall was first, and that would be you'd recall a performance that you had in which you performed at your best level. Like you threw the shot as far as you could, or you ran as super fast, or whatever it was. You were to have some kind of recall of that event to induce those kind of positive feelings you had. And then the final step was mental rehearsal, in which you would rehearse an activity you had not done yet and try to believe it. And the story that Dr. Curtis always told us, which I was always fascinated by, was there was a distance runner, and she was a tremendously talented distance runner, Tori Neubauer, for the University of Wisconsin lacrosse. And she, at the time when she was competing in Division III, I think that if I remember right, the way it worked is that if you won the cross-country national championships for Division III, you were then invited to go and run at the Division I national championships.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't think it happened at this race, but one of the things, but she was very talented, and she was always chasing national titles and national records and that sort of thing. And so one of the things that she and Dr. Curtis rehearsed, because it happens in cross-country races or in track and field distance races, is what happens if during the race someone steps on the back of your heel and your shoe comes off. Yeah. Because she wanted to prepare for any kind of contingency she might have at a championship meet. She didn't want to have some little thing go wrong to cost her a national title. And so they rehearsed this very scenario in a shoe coming off. And so sure enough, at a race, now, again, I don't know if it was at a championship meet of some sort, but at a meet of some sort, that very thing happened. That during the race, and whether it was at the start of the race or middle of the race, I'm not certain, but her shoe was kicked off her foot. And she continued to run the race, and she won the race. And when she got done, someone kind of pointed to her feet and said, "That was really amazing. You did it with only one shoe on." And she looked down, and she didn't even realize that she was without a shoe. She was so prepared for that occasion, for that specific scenario, that she didn't even know it happened.
Phase her
she didn't even know what happened. She competed without it, kind of thing. And I think it speaks to that idea of, like, if you really believe it, you can achieve certain things. And you can kind of go back to the Eastern Bloc countries and their autogenic training that they were doing, and they would hypnotize athletes into believing they were super strong and that kind of stuff. And I think it really does play a part with this whole idea of the placebo effect, and that you are kind of deceiving yourself,
right?
In this case, but you could also have a coach that deceives you as well.
Yeah, but I mean, you can even do it to deceive yourself and get a lot of benefit. Like we were speaking to students earlier today about just becoming almost numb to the weight on the bar, where you don't really let it get inside your head. You don't think about it. I think that almost might be a way to sort of deceive yourself, no matter how heavy it is.
It's the Ronnie Coleman lightweight kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or what Sarah Knott, I guess, had that one commercial after she won gold in the Olympics, walking up to the bar saying it only weighs 1 pound. Or Tara Knott, yeah, the old soccer player. Only weighed 1 pound, 1 feather, or something like that. Whereas it's lies a feather, easy enough.
Yeah.
So you can
you are essentially deceiving yourself, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that there is something to that. I mean, I use that to help myself perform better mentally and all of that, and there definitely seems to be an effect there for that as well. I think for the visualization you were talking about, it's just useful to get those extra reps and sets of high success environment, of being in a place where it's always that positive affirmation, and then
and you were telling me a story. You were talking with Dr. Kernodle, and you were telling me about you gave an example of downhill skiers, right?
Yeah, it was downhill skiers. I forget the person who was working with them, but they put on EMGs and then ran a course, the course that they would be skiing later on in the competition, and then they record when they're firing which muscles and things like that. But then they put them into a dark room and then had them revisualize the course, every turn, and as they did, they also had EMG attached to the people still. And as they did, the EMG would fire in those muscles that would be used as turn one way, turn the next. So they were going through the course and getting that extra exposure to it just mentally, and then their muscles were firing along the same way, showing how powerful the mind-body connection could be.
And that was the idea behind it when Dr. Curtis was talking to us about if certain sports, it's very difficult to replicate a skill a lot because it's a very physically demanding kind of a skill. And so by doing mental rehearsal and mental recall, you essentially are able to practice your skill without beating up your body. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of my college teammates. He's actually producing a movie right now, and he's crowdsourcing it. It's on Kickstarter, and it's called Stadium of Mind. And it's a story about a variety of athletes, and one athlete in particular, Dave McLaren, who I ran track with, who went on to have a great success, but he had a lot of physical limitations. He was not super strong. He was not super tall, but he believed and he visualized himself being able to compete at a high level in the shot put, and he went on and achieved great success. And it's a variety of stories like that, but but it can work the opposite way too. In fact, we were talking just today when we were working in the weight room with some of our students here, is that certain athletes can become so down on themselves in their performance that even if it was a good attempt in a lift, for example, or a good effort in whatever
you're nitpicking it apart so much that you also you destroy yourself. It's just awful. Yeah.
So I think it can go both ways.
Everything's terrible. Even though you just made a good lift and it would have been white lighted, you're just like, everything's terrible.
Right. Exactly.
Interesting. Now, before we're ready to finish this up here, I just wanted to ask you one more thing about visualization, because I've heard a couple of different ones. Did any of your previous professors or any of the books you've read talk about doing so from the third person perspective or maybe a first person?
This kind of plays into the idea of the downhill skier kind of study, I think, is the idea that you want to have that recall and that rehearsal happen through your own eyes.
Okay.
Because when you ultimately do the task, you aren't watching yourself.
Right.
You know? And you and I have had this discussion a little bit too, is that nowadays with video cameras being so ubiquitous on every phone and every mobile device, we have that. And so we're used to seeing ourselves outside of our bodies.
Right.
But when it comes to visualization, it appears to be more successful if you can visualize it from what you would be seeing while you're actually doing the task.
Yeah.
Because there's a better mind-body kind of connection in terms of the firing rates or the muscle firing that you have for those skills. Whereas when you look at it from outside yourself, you're not truly experiencing it. You're just viewing it.
Yeah, you might be thinking of technical points, hips down, chest up, whatever it is, but you're not really feeling it.
Right.
Whereas I would imagine at other things that would be tied to memory and then probably successul attempts on the lift or whatever it is, like smell and sounds and things like that.
Yeah, so this actually reminds me that when we would do a lot of mental imagery, especially leading up to our national championships.
Okay.
And so what our head coach would do, Mark Guthrie, what he would do is he would either himself or he would have an assistant coach or whatever. They would travel out to wherever the venue was for the national championship, and they would shoot actual video of what the facility looked like, especially if it was a facility that we'd never seen before, which was oftentimes the case for a national meet.
Yeah.
And the idea behind that then was that as part of our mental imagery then, we would include images of that facility. And so, for example, he would instruct the coach that would shoot the video, like, make sure you shoot a shot of what the long jump runway looks like, or the pole vault approach, or things that you would include in your actual imagery, because the more real you can make it be in terms of what it looks like, but also, like you said, what does it smell like? What does it sound like? And that was part of the recall process when Dr. Curtis would take us through that. He's like, what do you smell? What do you see? Because the more rich you can paint that tapestry, the more real it is to your actual body. And so that was kind of the idea behind it. And if you look at it from a third-person perspective, it's not real.
Right.
And I think it is very hard. If you've ever tried to do like a first-person mental imagery, it is very difficult because it's hard to remember what you're seeing and what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easier to view yourself from another person's perspective.
Well, I know we used to train people with Olympic lifting where we'd have them just like draw an X on the wall in front of them or something, or pick a point if you couldn't draw on the wall, wherever you were. But pick a point and just stare at that. Most of those to help keep their head up so they weren't dropping their head or anything like that, which would drop their chest or shoulder girdle. But I think that might help out a little bit too if you can kind of narrow down their field of vision, so to speak, so that way they only have one thing to focus on, then the rest of it's more of the ambient things, the smells and the sounds.
I'll share a quick story as we kind of close here. But so we did mental imagery as part of my training when I was in track and field, and I was a decent high school athlete, but not a very good one. I mean, I wasn't recruited really by anyone, and I walked on to Division III school, which tells you how not recruited I essentially was. Right. I wasn't recruited by anybody, but and during my sophomore year, I redshirted that year, and during that year, then that's when I started kind of getting more accepting of the idea of mental imagery. At first, it seems really weird. You're an 18-year-old kid. You're like, I'm not going to close my eyes in a dark room.
Oh, right, everybody close your eyes together.
It seems really stupid, But I started doing that during that year, and then my goal was to be an All-American. That's what I wanted to be. And so part of that imagery process that we were taught about was like, imagine now what it would look like if you achieved your goal. And I remember the image I had was of myself standing on top of a podium and looking down at my head coach, Mark Guthrie, who's the head coach. And I remember essentially making a derogatory gesture towards Coach Guthrie because his way of motivating me in particular was to kind of tell me that I wasn't very good. Because he knew that would push my buttons, that it would make me really work extra hard to do it. Right. Because I always felt like I was always in somebody else's shadow, essentially. And it definitely was the case because we had some really, really talented athletes on that team. But they graduated. That year I redshirted was their senior year. And so that junior year was like, okay, if you're going to be good, this is your chance because they're all gone now, essentially. And I recall vividly that image of myself on top of that podium that I would see from my own eyes and looking down at Coach when I actually ended up going to the national meet. I qualified for the national meet that junior year, and I was All-American. And sure enough, my position on the podium was exactly the position that I had in my head.
Oh, really?
When I looked down, And it's amazing to think about that. And to go along with this, Andrew Rock, who was an athlete on our team, he went on to win a gold medal as part of the 4x4 relay at the Olympics that was in Athens. And his goal was to compete at the World Championships and get a medal individually in the 400. And he wrote down a time that he wanted to run at that meet, wrote on a piece of paper, put an envelope and sealed the envelope and gave it to his coach. And just told him to hold on to it. And so months in advance of the actual race. And then when he went and ran the race, got a silver medal at the World Championships in the 400, and he was in Helsinki or whatever it was. And then he asked the coach, go ahead and open up the envelope. And he opened up the envelope, and he wrote that. It was the exact time.
That's incredible.
The exact time that he ran.
David Blaine business right there.
But it speaks to ideas like if you have a person that, no matter what it is, whether it's mental imagery or a warm-up or any kind of supplement you're going to give somebody, if they don't honestly believe it's going to work, I think it's going to minimize how it's going to actually affect that person.
That's very true, yeah. How interesting. That's incredible that you were able to get that place. I'm still as blown away by that, how successful that worked for you.
It's amazing. It's not a super difficult thing, but you've got to believe it.
Yeah, well, that's true. I know that I've myself talked myself up talking about the strongest person in the gym time. Show them, let's show them what it's really about here. So, and don't have the warm-ups and get into the work sets and see what all the noise has been about up until now.
Sure.
So,
well, thanks for bringing that article in, Michael. I had, like you said, I had no idea what you were going to bring in. I find these topics fascinating, the way your mind will respond to training.
Right, yeah. I thought it was pretty interesting, too, because it does seem like there's a lot to it there, especially a lot that we aren't quite sure about how it works yet, just because of the division between pharmacological studies and just these more applied studies where it is hard to tease out what exactly is going on. So. Yeah. I thought this would be an interesting first one to bring in more than just like a straight up nutrition talk or something.
This is good, though. I think we should do something like this again. I like this. I like the mystery. Leading up to it, right?
Yeah, because I wasn't really sure how this would play out, to be honest with you.
I
think this might be one of our best ones yet.
Awesome. All right, well, I don't want to tease our next podcast. I don't know if we know what it's going to be yet.
Not quite.
But we'll try to be back sooner than we were last time.
I think we've got some open weekends, so we should be pretty good from here on out.
Sounds great. All right, Michael.
Thanks, Travis.
Have a great day.
And you too.